The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Thorne Global boardroom, matching the stormy atmosphere inside. Alistair Thorne, Chief Executive Officer and heir to the city's most ruthless corporate empire, stared at the legal documents scattered across the mahogany table. His uncle Elias offered a thin, calculated smile from across the room. The terms of the late patriarch's will were absolute and completely absurd. Alistair had to be legally married by his 33rd birthday, a mere 3 weeks away, or the controlling shares of the company would automatically transfer to Elias. It was a transparent trap, an archaic clause meant to tame a man who refused to be controlled, but Alistair would rather burn the building to the ground than lose his legacy to a man he despised. He needed a wife immediately. He did not need a partner, and he certainly did not want a lover. He needed a signature on a binding contract. He needed someone who would take a massive payout, play the part for the cameras, and ask absolutely no questions. Later that evening, the towering corporate headquarters was mostly empty. Alistair walked through the dimly lit basement archives, searching for a misfiled property deed that his assistant had misplaced. Instead, he found her. Ilara Linwood sat on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by towering stacks of financial records dating back a decade. She wore a faded grey sweater, her dark hair tied back in a messy knot. When she looked up at him, there was no shock, no fear, and no reverence. There was only a quiet, piercing intelligence that made Alistair pause. "You are in the restricted section, Mr. Thorne," Ilara said, her voice perfectly steady as she closed a heavy, dust-covered ledger. Alistair raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised that a lowly archive clerk would dare correct him in his own building. He noticed the way her hands lingered protectively over a specific box of files from a defunct subsidiary. He did not know that Ilara had spent the last 2 years quietly tracing the breadcrumbs of a massive financial ruin that had destroyed her family, a ruin orchestrated by a phantom division of this very company. To him, she was simply the most unbothered, invisible woman he had ever encountered. In a flash of cold logic, he realized she was absolutely perfect for his plan. "I need to make a business proposition," Alistair said, stepping closer until he towered over her. $1 million in exchange for exactly 1 year of your life. You will marry me. You will smile for the press. And you will never demand a single thing beyond what is outlined in our confidentiality agreement. Ilara stood up slowly, brushing the dust from her jeans. She knew she should have laughed in his arrogant face and walked away, but $1 million would pay off the crippling debts left behind by her late father. More importantly, becoming Alistair Thorne's wife would give her unrestricted access to the highest executive levels of the company, the very levels where the evidence she desperately needed to clear her father's name was hidden. "I do not care about your money," she lied smoothly, lifting her chin to meet his intense gaze without flinching. "But I will accept the arrangement if you guarantee my complete independence outside of public appearances. I will not be your obedient puppet behind closed doors." Alistair felt a strange, unfamiliar flicker of respect. Most women in his world would have groveled, swooned, or tried to manipulate him for more money. Ilara merely negotiated her boundaries. The wedding took place exactly 2 weeks later, in a cold, cavernous room at the City Hall, devoid of flowers, music, or warmth. Alistair wore a meticulously tailored charcoal suit, his expression as unreadable and hard as stone. Ilara wore a simple, elegant white dress she had bought off a clearance rack. When the magistrate pronounced them husband and wife, Alistair leaned in to kiss her cheek, a mandatory gesture for the lone photographer they had hired to legitimize the event. As his lips brushed her skin, he noticed she was remarkably warm, and he caught the faint, grounding scent of vanilla and old paper. For a brief, irrational second, his chest tightened, a sensation he immediately dismissed as stress. As they turned to leave the desolate hall, Elias stood blocking the heavy wooden doors, leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane. The older man swept his cold gaze over Ilara, his eyes lingering with a toxic mixture of disdain and suspicion. Elias leaned in and whispered to Alistair that a stray dog dressed in white was still a stray, and that this pathetic, transparent charade would not save him from losing the company. Ilara stepped forward before Alistair could even open his mouth to retaliate. She looked directly into the older man's eyes, her voice dangerously calm and echoing in the empty hall. "A stray dog knows exactly how to survive on the streets," she said, her tone dripping with quiet venom. "I would be very careful not to back one into a corner." Alistair stared at his new bride, a sudden wave of realization washing over him. He had married a quiet, invisible archive clerk to solve a temporary corporate problem. But as she pushed past his uncle and walked out into the pouring rain with her head held high, he realized he had brought something entirely unpredictable into his carefully controlled world. The contract was signed, the legal obligation was met, but as he watched her wait for him in the storm, Alistair knew the real game was only just beginning. The transition into the penthouse was a battleground of silent defiance. Alistair expected Ilara to readily embrace the sprawling glass-walled apartment overlooking the city skyline, complete with a wardrobe of designer gowns he had preemptively purchased. Instead, she ignored the extravagant closet entirely, continuing to wear her simple, worn clothes. When he tried to present her with a diamond necklace before their first public gala, she refused to let him fasten it around her neck. She looked at him through the mirror, her eyes hard, and told him that she was a paid employee on his arm, not a doll he could dress up to soothe his ego. Her refusal stung, an unfamiliar sensation for a man used to buying compliance. Yet as they navigated the crowded ballroom that night, he found himself captivated not by the glittering socialites, but by the sharp, intelligent way his wife dismantled the condescending remarks of his investors. Later that week, the exhausting charade began to take its toll on her. Ilara caught a severe chill after walking home in the cold wind, stubbornly refusing to use the private driver Alistair had assigned to her. Late in the night, she woke up in her separate guest bedroom to find a tray on her nightstand. It held a steaming cup of tea brewed exactly the way she liked it, alongside a rare, out-of-print book on financial law she'd casually mentioned days ago. There was no note, but she knew the staff had all gone home. It was a quiet, careful gesture that made the impenetrable walls around her heart crack, just a fraction. But the fragile peace shattered violently on a Tuesday evening. Alistair returned to the penthouse early and found the heavy oak doors of his private study slightly ajar. Inside, Ilara was frozen by his desk, clutching a file folder labeled with the exact defunct subsidiary she had been researching in the basement archives. The air in the room turned to ice. He demanded to know what she was doing in his private records. With nowhere left to hide, Ilara slammed the folder onto his desk. Her voice shook with years of repressed grief as she revealed that the very company giving him his precious inheritance had driven her father to bankruptcy and an early grave. She confessed the truth, that she had only agreed to marry him to find the proof needed to clear her family name and expose the corruption. The betrayal cut deeper than Alistair could have ever anticipated. He had assumed she was just a desperate woman needing a payout, but she had been playing him from the very beginning. His pride demanded that he throw her out, but as he looked at the devastating pain in her eyes, a terrible realization dawned on him. He had not known about the subsidiary's illegal actions, but as the chief executive, the sins of his family were now his own. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the next 2 weeks, they lived like ghosts in the massive penthouse. They attended mandatory dinners, smiling for the cameras and holding hands, but behind closed doors they did not speak a single word. The silent punishment was agonizing for both of them, but the true danger was brewing outside their walls. Elias Thorne had not been idle. The malicious uncle had hired private investigators to dig into Ilara's past, searching for any weakness to exploit. Elias finally discovered her true identity and the crushing tragedy her father had endured at the hands of the Thorne Empire. Armed with this knowledge, Elias prepared to strike a fatal blow. He secretly summoned the board of directors for an emergency meeting, intending to expose Ilara as a corporate spy and a fraud. If he could prove the marriage was contracted under false pretenses with malicious intent against Thorne Global, the inheritance clause would be immediately invalidated, stripping Alistair of his company and destroying Ilara's life in one brutal, calculated move. The emergency board meeting was called to order with the heavy strike of a gavel. Elias stood at the head of the long mahogany table, a triumphant sneer plastered across his face. The room was packed with the most powerful shareholders of Thorne Global. Elias cleared his throat and began his speech, painting Ilara not as a wife, but as a malicious corporate spy intent on bringing down their empire from the inside. He waved a thick file in the air, declaring it contained the proof of her deception. Just as he demanded that Alistair be stripped of his position, the heavy double doors swung open. Alistair and Ilara walked into the room together, their steps perfectly synchronized. There was no distance between them anymore. Alistair did not look like a defeated man. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Ilara walked beside him, holding her head high, carrying the very ledger she had found in the basement archives. Alistair calmly approached the table and took the file from his uncle's hand, tossing it aside without a glance. He told the board that his uncle was only telling half the truth. Ilara placed the dusty, heavy ledger onto the polished wood. She looked directly at Elias, her voice echoing clearly in the vast room. She explained that she had indeed come looking for the truth about the defunct subsidiary that destroyed her family, but what she found was not Alistair's signature on those illegal orders. She opened the ledger, exposing the meticulously hidden records. It was Elias who had orchestrated the hostile takeover of her father's company. It was Elias who had embezzled the funds and buried the evidence in the archives, hiding his crimes from the late patriarch and the rest of the board. The color drained from Elias' face as the shareholders leaned in to inspect the documents. The room erupted into chaos. Elias tried to stutter a defense, claiming the documents were forged, but Alistair cut him off with a chilling finality. Alistair announced that copies had already been handed over to federal investigators that very morning. Elias was not only immediately removed from the board and stripped of his shares, but he would also be facing years in a federal prison. As security guards entered the room to escort the disgraced uncle out, Elias looked back one last time, completely broken, realizing he had been destroyed by the very woman he tried to use as a pawn. Hours later, the penthouse was quiet, but the suffocating tension was gone. Alistair stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city skyline. Ilara stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself. Alistair turned to her, the armor he had worn his entire life finally gone. He stepped closer, taking her hands in his voice thick with raw emotion. He told her he was deeply sorry for the pain his family had caused hers, and that he would spend the rest of his life making it right. He confessed that the contract they signed meant nothing to him anymore. He did not want a business arrangement, and he did not want a compliant wife for the cameras. He wanted her exactly as she was, fiery, brilliant, and unyielding. Ilara looked up into his eyes, searching for any trace of the cold executive she had first met in the archives. She found only complete, undeniable sincerity. The walls she had built around her own heart crumbled completely. She reached up, resting her hand against his cheek, and told him that she did not need him to fix her past. She just needed him to be part of her future. When he kissed her, there were no photographers, no hidden agendas, and no secrets. It was just two people who had found light in the darkest corners of each other's lives. A year later, the sun shone brightly on the newly unveiled Linwood Foundation, a philanthropic branch of Thorn Global dedicated to supporting small businesses facing unfair corporate practices. Alistair and Ilara stood side by side on the steps of the new building, surrounded by cheering crowds and genuine smiles. Ilara wore a stunning tailored suit, radiating confidence as she cut the ceremonial ribbon. Alistair watched her with overwhelming pride, knowing that the greatest wealth he had ever acquired was not his company, but the fierce, brilliant woman standing beside him. They had taken a legacy built on ruthlessness and transformed it into one of hope. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of love and redemption. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time.
Editor. The infographic presents Alistair and Ilara's story as a journey from control and secrecy toward truth, responsibility, and genuine partnership. At the beginning, Alistair is trapped by a family legacy that measures his worth through power, inheritance, and obedience. The marriage clause forces him to treat intimacy like a transaction, revealing how deeply he relies on control to avoid vulnerability. Ilara accepts the arrangement for a completely different reason. She is not searching for welfare status. She wants access to the evidence that can restore her father's name and expose the corruption that destroyed her family. Their marriage therefore begins with two hidden agendas, one driven by fear of losing power and the other by grief and the need for justice. The psychological analysis shows that both characters use emotional distance as protection. Alistair hides behind authority, wealth, and rigid rules because he sees relationships as risks. Ilara protects herself through restraint, independence, and suspicion because trusting the Thorne family would seem like a betrayal of everything her father suffered. Their conflict becomes inevitable when the truth about her investigation is revealed. Alistair feels manipulated, while Ilara sees his anger as another expression of the same system that harmed her family. The silence between them demonstrates how pride and unresolved trauma can create distance even when respect and affection are already growing. The social themes connect their private conflict to larger problems. Ilara is underestimated because she is an archive clerk, showing how class prejudice causes powerful people to ignore intelligence and courage when they appear in someone without wealth or status. The hidden subsidiary represents corporate corruption and the way institutions can bury responsibility behind records, titles, and influence. Elias uses secrecy and social hierarchy to protect himself, but his downfall proves that power becomes fragile when documented truth survives. In the boardroom, Ilara brings evidence, while Alistair chooses accountability over family loyalty and personal advantage. Their relationship develops from contract to suspicion, conflict, trust, and partnership. Love becomes believable only after both characters abandon manipulation and accept responsibility. Alistair stops viewing Ilara as part of a strategy and recognizes her as an equal whose courage exposes the failures of his family. Ilara sees that he is capable of separating himself from the corruption he inherited and using his position to repair damage rather than conceal it. Their bond grows through honesty, mutual respect, and the willingness to face painful truths together. The Linwood Foundation completes the story's message of redemption through action. Clearing Ilara's father's name is not enough. The couple transforms personal healing into social responsibility by supporting small businesses harmed by abusive corporate practices. This final step shows that remorse has value only when it produces change. The infographic explains that power without integrity destroys lives, trauma can isolate people, and love becomes meaningful when it includes justice, respect, and accountability. What begins as a legal arrangement ultimately becomes a shared commitment to build a future different from the past.